Chapter 3. We come now to that other mode of likeness which, we read, is the fruit of the loftier virtues. Discussing this, we shall penetrate more deeply into the essence of civic virtue, and be able to define the nature of the higher kind, whose existence we shall establish beyond doubt. To Plato, unmistakably, there are two distinct orders of virtue, and the civic does not suffice for likeness. Likeness to God, he says, is a flight from this world's ways and things. In dealing with the qualities of good citizenship, he does not use the simple term virtue, but adds the distinguishing word civic. And elsewhere he declares all virtues without exception to be purifications. But in what sense can we call the virtues purifications? And how does purification issue in likeness? As the soul is made evil by being interfused with the body, and by coming to share the body's states and to think the body's thoughts, so it would be good, it would be possessed of virtue, if it threw off the body's moods and devoted itself to its own act, the state of intellection and wisdom, never allowed the passions of the body to affect it, the virtue of moral balance, knew no fear at the parting from the body, the virtue of fortitude, and if reason and the intellectual principle ruled, which is the state of righteousness. Given such a disposition in the soul would become thus intellective and immune to passion. It would not be wrong to call this likeness to God, for the divine too is pure, and the divine act is such that likeness to it is wisdom. But would this not make virtue a state of the divine also? No. The divine has no states. The state is in the soul. The act of intellection in the soul is not the same as in the divine. Of things in the supreme, the soul grasps some after a mode of its own, and others not at all. Then yet again, does this mean that the one word intellection covers two distinct acts? No. Rather, there is a primal intellection, and there is an intellection deriving from the primal, of another scope. As speech is the echo of thought in the soul, so thought in the soul is an echo from elsewhere. That is to say, as the uttered thought is an image of the soul thought, so the soul thought images a thought above itself, and is the interpreter of the higher sphere. Virtue, in the same way, is a thing of the soul. It does not belong to the intellectual principle or the transcendence. Chapter 4. We come, so, to the question whether purification is the whole of this human quality, virtue, or merely the forerunner upon which virtue follows. Does virtue imply the achieved state of purification, or does the mere process suffice to it? Virtue being something of less perfection than the accomplished pureness, which is almost the term. To have been purified is to have cleansed away everything alien, but goodness is something more. If before the impurity entered there was goodness, the goodness suffices, but even so, not the act of cleansing, but the cleansed thing that emerge will be the good. And it remains to establish what this emergent is. It can scarcely prove to be the good. The absolute good cannot be thought to have taken up its abode with evil. We can think of it only as something of the nature of good, but paying a double allegiance, unable to rest in the authentic good. The soul's true good is in its devotion to the intellectual principle, its kin. Evil to the soul lies in frequenting strangers. There is no other way for it to purify itself, and so to enter into relation with its own. The new phase begins by a new orientation. After the purification, then, there is still this orientation to be made? No, by the purification the true alignment stands accomplished. The soul's virtue, then, is this alignment? No, it is what the alignment brings about within. And this is that it sees, that like sight affected by the thing seen, The soul admits the imprint, graven upon it and working within it, of the vision it has come to. But was not the soul possessed of this always, or had it forgotten? What it now sees, it certainly always possessed, but as lying away in the dark, not as acting within it, to dispel the darkness and thus come to the knowledge of its inner content. It must thrust towards the light. Besides, it possessed not the originals, but images, pictures, and these it must bring into closer accord with the verities they represent. And further, if the intellectual principle is said to be a possession of the soul, this is only in the sense that it is not alien, and that the link becomes very close when the soul's sight is turned towards it. Otherwise, ever present though it may be, it remains foreign, just as our knowledge. If it does not determine action, it is dead to us. Chapter 5. So we come to the scope of the purification. That understood, the nature of likeness becomes clear. Likeness to what principle? Identity to what God? The question is substantially this: how far does purification dispel the two orders of passion, anger, desire, and the like, with grief and its kin, and in what degree the disengagement from the body is possible? Disengagement means simply that the soul withdraws to its own place. It will hold itself above all passions and affections, necessary pleasures, and all the activity of the senses it will employ only for medicament and assuagement, lest its work be impeded. Pain it may combat, but failing the cure, it will bear meekly and ease it by refusing to assent to it. All passionate act it will check. The suppression will be complete, if that be possible. But at worst, the soul will never itself take fire, but will keep the involuntary and uncontrolled outside its own precincts, and rare and weak at that. The soul has nothing to dread, though no doubt the involuntary has some power here too. Fear, therefore, must cease, except so far that it is purely monitory. What desire there may be can never be for the vile. Even the food and drink necessary for restoration will lie outside the soul's attention, and not less the sexual appetite. Or, if such desire there must be, it will turn upon the actual needs of the nature, and will be entirely under control. Or if any uncontrolled motion takes place, it will reach no further than the imagination, be no more than a fleeting fancy. The soul itself will be involatilely free, and will be working to set the irrational part of the nature above all attack, or, if that may not be, then at least to preserve it from violent assault, or that any wound it takes may be slight and be healed at once by virtue of the soul's presence, just as a man living next door to a proficient would profit by the neighborhood, either in becoming wise and good himself, or for sheer shame, never venturing any act which the nobler mind would disapprove. There will be no battling in the soul. The mere intervention of reason is enough. The lower nature will stand in such awe of reason that for any slightest movement it has made it will grieve, and censure its own weakness in not having kept low and still in the presence of its Lord. Chapter 6. In all of this there is no sin. There is only a matter of discipline. But our concern is not merely to be sinless, but to be God. As long as there is any such involuntary action, the nature is twofold, God and demigod, or rather, God in association with the nature of a lower power. When all the involuntary is suppressed, there is God unmingled, a divine being of those that follow upon the first. For at this height, the man is the very being that came from the Supreme. The primal excellence restored, the essential man is there, entering this sphere. He has associated himself with a lower phase of his nature, but even this he will lead up into likeness with his highest self, as far as it is capable, so that if possible, it shall never be inclined to, and at least never adopt, any course displeasing to its overlord. What form, then, does each virtue take in one so lofty? Wisdom and understanding consist of the contemplation of all that exists in the intellectual principle. And the intellectual principle itself apprehends this all, not by contemplation, but as an immediate presence. And each of these has two modes according as it exists in the intellectual principle and in the soul. In the soul it is virtue, in the supreme, not virtue. In the supreme, then, what is it? Its proper act and its essence. The act and essence of the supreme, manifested in a new form, constitute the virtue of this sphere. For the ideal form of justice or any other virtue is not itself a virtue, but, so to speak, an exemplar, the source of what in the soul becomes virtue. For virtue is dependent, seated in something not itself. The ideal form is self-standing, independent. But taking rectitude to be the due ordering of faculty, does it not always imply the existence of diverse parts? No. There is rectitude of diversity appropriate to what has parts, but there is another, not less rectitude than the former, though it resides in a unity. And the authentic, absolute rectitude is the act of unity upon itself, of a unity in which there is no this and that and the other. On this principle, the supreme rectitude of the soul is that it directs its act toward the intellectual principle. Its restraint is its inward bending towards the intellectual principle. Its fortitude is its being impassive in the likeness of that towards which its gaze is set, whose nature comports an impassivity which the soul acquires by virtue, and must acquire if it is not to be at the mercy of every state arising in its less noble companion. Chapter 7. The virtues in the soul run in a sequence correspondent to that existing in the overworld, that is, among their exemplars in the intellectual principle. In the supreme, intellection constitutes knowledge and wisdom. Self-concentration is moral balance. Its proper act is its dutifulness. Its immateriality, by which it remains inviolate within itself, is the equivalent of fortitude. And if the term of purification is the production of a pure being, then the purification of the soul must produce all the virtues. If any are lacking, then not one of them is perfect. And to possess the greater is potentially to possess the minor, though the minor need not carry the greater with them. Thus we have indicated the dominant note in the life of the sage. But whether his possession of the minor virtues be actual as well as potential, whether even the greater are in act in him or yield to the qualities higher still, must be decided afresh in each case. Take, for example, contemplative wisdom. If other guides of conduct must be called in to meet a given need, can this virtue hold its ground even in mere potentiality? And what happens when the virtues in their very nature differ in scope and province, where, for example, moral balance would allow certain acts or emotions under due restraint, and another virtue would cut them off altogether? And is it not clear that they all may have to yield once contemplative wisdom comes into action? The solution is in understanding the virtues and what each has to give. Thus, the man will learn to work with this, or that as every need demands. And as he reaches to the loftier principles and the other standards, these in turn will define his conduct. For example, restraint in its earlier form will no longer satisfy him. He will work for the final disengagement. He will live no longer the human life of the good man, such as civic virtue commends, but leaving this beneath him, will take up instead another life, that of the gods. For it is to the gods, not to the good, that our likeness must look. To model ourselves upon good men is to produce an image of an image. We have to fix our gaze above the image and attain its likeness to the supreme exemplar.